You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 31st of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Le Pen proves less mighty than Le Gavel. The White House Correspondents Association celebrates free speech by cancelling their after-dinner speaker. And should an MP's interests end at the boundaries of their constituency? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Elisabeth, Braw and Ben Kelly will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll visit an exhibition chronicling the photographic history of a century of British descent. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation, and by Ben Kelly, Senior Audience Editor at Newsweek. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Elisabeth, you have recently been visiting Bavaria, which is delightful, but not for necessarily entirely delightful reasons.
No, I was at the NATO school, which is a NATO installation in Bavaria, where, as the name suggests, they teach various people, civilians and military. And there was a conference on military procurement. And that, I tell you, Andrew, is not an enjoyable subject. It's incredibly complicated.
It is.
It's incredibly complicated, even for those who do nothing but military procurement. I had the privilege of speaking there, but I felt that, frankly, everybody in the audience could have equally have spoken at my panel, because it is incredibly complicated. It has to happen very quickly now that the security situation is deteriorating. So I would not want to be in their position, having to acquire weaponry of all kinds very rapidly, even as the security situation is deteriorating.
But just to follow that up quickly, did you get the sense from the people gathered, not necessarily that they were seized with the urgency of imminent and abundant procurement, because actual military people rarely require persuasion of that. Did they seem persuaded that their political overlords have at last apprehended the seriousness of matters?
Yes, the political overlords in many countries have grasped the seriousness of the situation, but it's not just a matter of political will, and that was so frustrating, even in the countries such as Estonia, Sweden, Poland, where defense spending has gone up significantly. Estonia is now at 5%, Poland 5%, Sweden 3.5%. Even there, where there is a lot of ambition, a lot of goodwill, you still have those pesky details. And also what you have, Andrew, is a lack of skilled workers, because manufacturing weapons is not a skill you learn quickly. And where are the workers who have those skills, or who could be trained to have those skills, or acquire those skills? They are not standing by. We don't have those workers. We will have to train them, and companies will have to poach them from other companies, but it's not going to be quick.
Ben, amid my considerable arsenal of seamless pivots, I'm not sure I have one, from military procurement crises to an LGBT film festival, but let's just roll with it, because you have recently attended such a conclave.
Yes, I was not among the great and good of NATO, but the BFI Flare Festival, which was actually in its 39th year, so next year will be 40 years, is a fantastic event which celebrates new filmmakers, LGBT films from all over the world. I saw a great one from Italy, from Argentina, etc. So I went there a few times in the past 2 weeks. You can still watch them online if you sign up to the BFI, but I would advise anyone to book early for the 40th anniversary next year, because it's very fun.
Well, that will be quite the wingding, and deservedly so. That is a considerable accomplishment. But for people who may be tempted towards the website and to log in, was there any one film in particular you saw that leapt out at you?
Yeah, I saw a great Italian one called High Tide, which was about an immigrant in Provincetown in the US, sort of falling in love there and having troubles with visas and stuff like that. Very, very of the moment.
Especially relatable on the visas front, by the sound of it at the moment. But we will begin Pen in France, which has now joined South Korea and Brazil among the cohort of countries apparently determined to demonstrate to one other prominent democracy, which may be leaping to mind, that when current, former or aspiring heads of state break the law, maybe the thing to do is act swiftly and decisively to prosecute them. As things presently stand, the French presidential election of 2027 will be the first since 1981 not to be blighted by the surname Le Pen, whether current National Rally leader Marine Le Pen or her late and unlamented father Jean-Marie, founder of the National Front. Marine has today been convicted of fiddling EU funds, banned from seeking office for 5 years, fitted with an electronic tag for 2, and fined €100,000. Elisabeth, first of all, I always have mixed feelings myself when stories like this erupt, because on the one hand, we should obviously be disheartened that somebody at such a lofty position in politics has committed actual crimes, but nonetheless it is kind of reassuring that even such a lofty personage cannot outrun the long arm of the law.
Indeed, and we should remember, as you said in the introduction, that there are several other current or very recent examples of political leaders being held to account in courts of law, including Nicolas Sarkozy in France, and the former president of South Korea South Korea, and indeed his interim replacement, who has just been cleared, but he has not been cleared. And it is reassuring that leaders in the highest positions can be held to account. I think what is a bit concerning about the Marine Le Pen case is that now she and her party will portray her as a victim of vindictive justice or establishment justice imposed on or visited upon parties that are not liked by the French establishment or the European establishment. And it's, I think, very easy for them to spin that story. But it is the basis is that she committed a crime, the court has found, and has been found guilty. So it is a conflicted. I have a conflicted feeling about it, simply because I worry that it will this ruling will be exploited and will, in the end, harm democracy.
Well, the ruling will be exploited, obviously, and Elisabeth, you're quite right to suggest that National Rally will try to spin this as persecution by the establishment, because populist parties such as the National Rally spin literally everything as persecution by the establishment. But is that necessarily going to land? Does there come a point, he said optimistically, Ben, at which voters start to think, this is kind of what you say all the damn time. Not everything is necessarily persecution, is it?
I'm not sure. I think maybe there's a dividing line between when you're on the outside of power and when you're on the inside. And for as long as you continue to be on the outside looking in, which Trump was for a while, for example, and now Marine Le Pen still is, you can always say the establishment is out to get you. I suppose even when you get on the inside, of course, then there's the deep state to tackle. But
those guys,
yeah, exactly,
always up to something.
I don't know. It's up to the French public. I think people in different countries react differently to this kind of thing. I think it's to do with what you believe. I mean, even when Trump was being put on trial for similar stuff, really, election interference and so on, we would see in polling that the majority of Americans believed both that he had crimes to answer for and that it was political, being pursued politically. So both of those things can be in tandem, and I think people will read into that here as well. They'll see that, yes, she did commit crimes and that's been put through the courts correctly, but are her political opponents benefiting from this? Yes, also. So I think both things can be true and sort of held in the same space. But I guess we'll have to wait and see how the French public respond to this and how they feel about it.
I mean, was it concerns like that, Elisabeth, do you think, that sort of stayed the hand of various justice departments in the United States over the last 4 years? Because clearly they could have acted more swiftly against Donald Trump on a number of fronts. It's fairly clear, to me at least, that they chose not to do that out of a combination of, well, it's a fine line between expedience and cowardice, but they chose not to come down on him as hard as they might have, and now he's president again.
I think in the case of the US courts and judges and prosecutors, they in the cases where they didn't come down on him as hard as you suggest they should have, it was out of a concern that they would be seen as interfering with democracy by essentially putting him on trial and then having him convicting him and then making him ineligible to stand for office because he might be in jail.
You can run for president from jail, though. It's been done.
Yes, but I wonder how successful that would have been. But anyway, they in the cases where they were reluctant to prosecute, that was the reason that they didn't want to be seen as interfering with democracy and thus being portrayed as the deep state, blocking a legitimate candidate from running. And we have seen similar concerns or similar sentiments in Romania, for example, where a presidential candidate was blocked by a court, and that has... It seems to have been a legitimate decision by the court, but nevertheless it has been portrayed as them interfering with the pursuit of democracy.
Just finally on this, Ben, does it matter, though, to any sort of populist movement, the personage at the front of it is important? Like, I don't think, for example, that Trumpism is anywhere near as successful in the United States without the figure of Donald Trump at the front of it, who, say whatever else one might about him, clearly does have some knack for connecting with a large number of voters. Marine Le Pen will probably be succeeded by Jordan Bardella, ridiculously youthful though he is. Is that going to land? I guess what I'm asking is, though she has repudiated her ghastly father in public, does some of his cachet, for what it might be worth, still adhere to the Le Pen name?
Well, she's been on a successful journey because she managed to sort of both scrub a little bit of her father away from herself and also solidify herself as a brand, just Marine, dropping the surname. And she actually built up something strong. I mean, she's going into this election, or was going into this election, in a stronger position than she has been in the previous two. So I think she did have that brand that Trump has and others have. I mean, you couldn't imagine anyone but Nigel Farage, for example, leading the British populist, etc. That person does matter. I don't know. I guess this guy, Jordan Bardella, could very well have a chance to make a go at it and make his imprint. But interestingly, remember back in February, he cancelled his appearance at CPAC in the US because of Elon Musk's salute. He didn't want to be associated with that. So I'll be very interested to see if he's the candidate, what his potentially right-wing supporters in the US think of him. Well,
to the United States and the looming White House Correspondents Association dinner, an annual works backslap and drink-up which should concern nobody but the invitees were it not for the fact that it has become, like everything else in the US, the front line of an inane partisan bun fight. Speakers at the WHCA dinner usually include senior politicians, including the most senior politician, and comedians, well, professional comedians, all of whom are expected to make an amount of fun of the government of the day. This year, however, a more sombre tone is to be taken. Putative host, the comedian Amber Collins, has been binned. Instead, perhaps ironically, we are promised a celebration of free speech. Elisabeth, why do we think they have done this? The obvious suggestion is that they didn't want Amber Collins to say anything that would upset President Trump, as she has in the past, but then he's probably not going. He never went to this event while he was president the first time.
Yeah, and I think what's different about him compared to his predecessors is that he really doesn't do humour.
Certainly not at his own expense.
No. And if you look at his predecessors, they were very different, extremely different, but they subjected themselves to this annual ritual with good humour. And it is an entertaining evening for all. And the president, it's a bit like, various carnivals that you have around the world. You can be a little bit crazy once a year, and the White House correspondents get to be a little bit humorous and poke fun once a year at the expense of the president, who can put up with it because it's just once a year, right? And they all put up with it, but it's just not his thing. So it would have been an uncomfortable experience for all. So I guess now it's not going to be a sort of a Fasching-like evening. It's going to be a somber evening.
I mean, there is a theory, Ben, which I think is actually quite plausible, that a future Edward Gibbon chronicling the decline and fall of the American empire might begin at the 2011 White House Correspondents Association dinner when then President Barack Obama lit gleefully into Donald Trump, who was in the audience and clearly didn't find any of it amusing. And the story goes that he resolved that night, well, I'll show them. So
the rest is history.
Exactly. On that grounds alone, should this event be abolished?
It's clearly the ground zero of Donald Trump's entire political career. I mean, I believe it is. I think you watch that clip back, and I sometimes do, and the jokes are quite, lighthearted. He's into conspiracy theories. First it's my birth certificate, and next it's who shot JFK and whatever. And Trump is just so stony faced. He was so unhappy. I do feel that was one where he thought, and of course Obama said, "Oh, at least I'm going to be a president, and you're not." The trigger is all there. So yeah, of course Trump is not going to go to this event again. But yeah, I think it's quite ironic that he isn't going to this sort of fun event and humorous event, because I think he is one of the funniest presidents there's ever been. He is a funny person and funny to look at, and funny. If it wasn't president, he'd be hilarious. But he clearly doesn't like being the butt of jokes. Although I am surprised he doesn't want to give give it back to all those reporters that give him so much grief all through the year. It would be his chance.
Well, it would be that. But this decision, Elisabeth, by the WHCA to pull the comedian and sort of try to reorient to something more serious, is there any way that isn't basically just as craven as it looks? Because this is a capitulation to Donald Trump, because everyone knows what would happen. You would book the comedian, she might come out and make a few mild jokes at the president's expense. He and his entire media ecosystem would go absolutely nuts. And, well, we're familiar with the argument by now.
Yes, and there is also the additional aspect that the White House now has taken over some of the things that the White House Correspondents Association used to do, things like whom to invite to various events at the White House, including the press briefing room. So I think the White House Correspondents Association is worried that if they do anything on top of what they're already doing that might aggravate the White House, they will lose whatever remaining privileges they have in the White House. And they have been, for the longest time, the sort of arbiters of access and who gets to sit where and so forth when briefings are conducted. And by the way, also when it comes to who gets to be on the pool in the Oval Office. But now the White House is essentially cracking down on that or taking over some of those decisions, and that is a very uncomfortable position to be in, or situation to be in for the White House Correspondents Association. And so they may just want to, they seem to want to expose themselves to as little risk as possible.
So would the thing to do then, Ben, just be to say, OK, we're just not going to have this dinner anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Certainly not while he's president, because it's just not going to be the same thing at all. It's kind of like, it's also part of a wider thing that he's doing culturally, which I think is very interesting. Where he got stuck into the Kennedy Center and he said, well, I'm going to be in charge of this now. And all the sort of great cultural titans of America who were involved in its board just said, well, we're leaving. So now he's just sort of standing there by himself, hoping they're going to put Evita back on again soon. And it's kind of like, well, that's not culture. And equally, he's having his say with the Smithsonian museums and so on. And I think it's really interesting to see him try and dictate the culture as well as the politics, because that's not something that's as easy to change and direct. That's something I'm very keen to keep an eye on and see where that goes.
Well, here in the UK, there have been few political wrangles so perennial, tedious and apparently unresolvable as the expansion of London's airport capacity, whether it be a third runway at Heathrow, a second at Gatwick, or a whole new artificial island in the Thames estuary, the lattermost one of the unrealised fever dreams of the mayoralty of Boris Johnson. However, it turns out that a coterie of British MPs are absolutely all aboard for one new airport in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. 20 MPs and or peers, mostly Labour, have written to Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, insisting that he build such a facility in Mirpur. Elisabeth, if Sir Keir Starmer was to receive a letter from a group of Pakistani MPs demanding a new airport in Nottingham, how seriously should he take it?
I think he'd say we have a parliament here and various local decision-making bodies. It is a little bit culturally insensitive and diplomatically insensitive to suggest what infrastructure projects another country might or should pursue, especially if you are not going to fund them, which the UK is not going to do.
No, despite some of the scare stories being got up by right-wing media, nobody here is offering UK's taxpayers money to actually pay for this thing. But nevertheless, is this really any different, Ben, from... I mean, all these MPs are representing areas which have substantial Pakistani communities in their constituencies. They are therefore just pandering to a major group in their constituency. Isn't that something every politician who has ever lived does?
Well, it is, but this one's particularly odd and the optics aren't great. You know, I saw the one that said...
The optics are spectacular.
Oh, my constituents are having to drive 3 hours to get to the airport. Yes, on the other side. You know, we're not going to do the same for you're going to Greece soon. I'm sure it's not going to be...
It is, in fact, about a 3-hour drive from Athens airport to where I'm going.
Well, you need to get on the blower to Athens then.
Well, I mean, the complaint is, as you suggest, that for British Kashmiris who are visiting Kashmir, it is hard because it is about a 3-hour drive from Islamabad, to which this Australian would retort, Elisabeth, it's a 5-hour drive from Sydney to Wagga Wagga.
and actually, isn't the remoteness of the airport a reason to invest in trains, considering that we do have to cut CO2 emissions and not just in Western countries but around the world? Not that I would advocate for British MPs suggesting or telling the Pakistani government what to invest in trains, but nevertheless, if they are going to make gentle suggestions to the government of Pakistan, perhaps train infrastructure investment into the train system and even high-speed trains might be a better idea than airports.
But on the subject of optics, Ben, you're right. This is the interesting thing about this, because it's one of those things where you just think, did nobody anywhere close to these MPs just say, this is a bad idea and here's why? One is that it is not going to get a single yard of asphalt laid on the Mirpur Airport runway, and also that this is an absolute gift to your opponents at all sorts of levels, not the least of which is that one of the MPs, Tariq Ali, who represents Birmingham, is representing a city which is in the grip of a major bin strike and is not unreasonably getting an earful from constituents saying priorities, mate.
Yeah, I mean, there's bags of rubbish all over the streets. You know, again, people just sharing these pictures of you know, on his Twitter account saying, you know, look at this, get this sorted out first. I think, you know, it's one thing being invested in, you know, things in other countries and having, you know, I know that a lot of these Labour MPs have been criticised in the past for being too concerned with, let's say, what's going on in Gaza rather than in their own constituencies and so on. I think sometimes you do have to kind of come back to basics, especially when you are just a constituency MP. You know, you're not the Prime Minister or something like that. And I think, you know, maybe commenting on something is one thing, but going out of your way to try and actively change something in another country when your own streets are littered with dirt, I think, you know, you've really got to go back to basics.
But would it be asking too much, trying to be vaguely sympathetic to these MPs and lords and dames, Elisabeth, would it be asking too much realistically for anybody in their position to say to their voters, who they are clearly trying to please, look, it sucks that you've got a 3-hour drive out of the airport when you get there, but this isn't really my department, can't help you, sorry?
Well, first of all, I do have some sympathy for people travelling in countries where maybe the airports are not as great as Copenhagen, which is my favourite. And I have to tell you, Heathrow Terminal 5 is amazing too, in Terminal 2. And I have to tell you, Andrew, the one and only time I've paid somebody to perform a service that was not legitimate was at the airport in Lahore, where I had a flight at 4 a.m. in the morning, and at 3 o'clock, at 2 o'clock, it was closed, and there were crowds of people outside trying to get in, and I had to get this flight to Dubai, and a man materialized and said, I can help you. And I said, okay. And he helped me get in. And then when I got in, he said, well, that would be, what would you like to pay me? And so I had to give him something. And I'm still ashamed. But I do have sympathy for people living or travelling to airports that may not be as great as Copenhagen, but nevertheless, let's stick to the rubbish in Birmingham and similar places.
Well, staying in the UK and especially in London, there is heartening news for those of us who may tend towards the view that the very idea of buskers is no more or less preposterous than that of budding dentists setting up on street corners or tube platforms and attempting to interest the passing public, i.e. if you were actually any good, people would pay for your services at an appointed time and designated venue. A judge has ordered Westminster City Council to silence such pests and bores after one business overlooking Leicester Square complained of a din so loud and unrelenting that staff were having to conduct business calls from inside cupboards. Elisabeth, fundamentally, should buskers be thrown into the river by an angry mob or not?
They should not, although I do have sympathy for the people at LBC and elsewhere who have to
justify this outrageous
who have to listen to subpar buskers. There are some really good buskers, and there is a Pulitzer Prize winning article about the busker at the Washington Metro. A reporter at the Washington Post decided to find out whether people would stop to listen if it were a really good musician. So he teamed up with one of the world's most famous violinists who put on a hoodie and a baseball cap and started playing the violin at the Washington Metro. Nobody stopped to listen, let alone give him any money, even though he's one of the world's most famous musicians. People pay big money to listen to him at Wigmore Hall and similar places. So there is some top talent hiding among buskers, but I don't think they turn up at Leicester Square.
See, I'm not sure that necessarily defeats my argument in that I remember that article well. It is a lovely piece of writing and I do recommend it to our listeners. But that person was not actually a busker. That person was a phenomenally gifted musician, as you correctly point out. And yet it reinforces my wider point that nobody wants to listen to these people, even when they're that good. People just trying to get the train.
Maybe it's the location. Maybe that's not where you want to see or hear music. Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, even when they're fantastic, people think, well, I'm on my way somewhere else. I don't want to hear this. But I'm led to believe it.
But doesn't it cheer you up when you're on the tube and you hear somebody playing, even if it's not the level of the Pulitzer Prize winning violinist, but just when somebody plays, even if it's not great, doesn't it cheer you up a bit?
No,
I think it needs to be
broadly
good.
The opposite effect.
But Andrew, here is, if we can maybe agree on another way of using music. Apparently, classical music calms people down, and at Pimlico tube station, I don't know the tube stations, but there they have had classical music piped out throughout the station. I love it because I love classical music, but apparently the effect it has on everybody else is it calms them down.
It's actually not as a calming measure. Genuinely, it is to deter teenagers. it actually is. They play that kind of stuff to keep young people away, which obviously I'm not opposed to. But
they used to play classical music like Vivaldi on Ryanair when you were boarding, and it was such fast and frenetic, and it just kind of like made the whole stressful situation even worse.
You should never play Vivaldi. It should be something...
and you should never fly Ryanair. That's neither here nor there.
I would like to cede an amount of my time to the presiding judge. He said, while the volume is the principal mischief, it is clear that the nuisance is exacerbated by the repetition and poor quality of some of the performances. The use of repetitive sounds is a well-publicised feature of unlawful but effective psychological torture techniques. But he has a point here in that buskers between them, in my experience, Ben, know about 4 songs. There was a guy who used to haunt St Christopher's Place, down which I usually walk to get back to the tube after doing a show here. And I don't know whether he was on some sort of internal or written down schedule, but literally every time I walked past him, which would have been more or less at the same time every day, he would be singing the same Bob Marley song, which I genuinely suspect may be literally the only piece of music he knew.
Yeah, I guess they're thinking, well, people are only passing me for a few seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, so they can just start again and people don't realise because they're just walking on. But if you're at the office nearby and you're hearing, let's get together and feel all right 40 times a day, you're going to have a problem.
Honestly, I don't think any jury would have convicted if an overlooking office worker had taken the law into their own hands. But to permit a certain amount of your point, Elisabeth, Westminster City Council's response was, following this judgment, the council will continue seeking a balance between minimising nuisance to our residents and businesses. Well, I've got some ideas about that. Whilst ensuring performers can continue to add to the vibrant heritage of street entertainment in Westminster that has been loved by many for decades.
So my issue, be classical music. See, that is the answer.
See, my issue is with the phrase "loved by many." Name two.
Well, you and me, maybe Ben and me, but it should be classical music. It's never too loud, and you've got to at least have some skill in order to play classical music.
I mean, just finally on this, Ben, should there be some sort of quality control imposed?
Well, I imagine there are a lot of people who want to have these spots, right? Because some of them you have to actually earn the spot, especially on the tube. You get little spots. So, if they're the best that there are,
I know.
Then,
It's a terrifying thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, on that sombre note, Elisabeth Braw and Ben Kelly, thank you for joining us. And finally, on today's show, from the suffragettes to anti-war protests, photographers have witnessed a century of British resistance. Curated and conceived by the artist and filmmaker Steve McQueen, a landmark exhibition has opened at Turner Contemporary in Margate, chronicling how ordinary people fought for change from 1903 to 2003. Monocle's Maisie Ringer went along to find out more.
From London's West End, racial violence.
From marches to sit-ins, strikes to boycotts, carnivals to kiss-ins, acts of resistance have been pivotal in shaping the Britain we see today. Whether it's the suffragettes marching London streets to mass protests against the Iraq War, these moments represent ordinary people demanding to be heard. At the Turner Contemporary Gallery, overlooking the Margate seafront, a new exhibition conceived by British filmmaker Steve McQueen documents a century of resistance in Great Britain. Over 200 black and white photographs showcase landmark moments of protest, alongside lesser-known movements that enrich and challenge conventional narratives of British history. Clary Wallace, director of Turner Contemporary and co-curator of Resistance, emphasises the importance of highlighting these little-known acts of defiance.
One of the things that's always interested Steve is this idea about untold or forgotten histories. For example, I didn't know about the plumage bill which came in, which stopped ostrich feathers being used in women's, fashion, but also it really heralded the beginnings of the RSPB. I think the story around the formation of the Notting Hill Carnival is also really important for people to know, and about how that was a direct response to the murder of Kelso Cochrane. Claudia Jones taking it upon herself and thinking, actually, what is the community response to this? And coming up with an idea about a Caribbean carnival.
The exhibition, drawn from public archives and personal collections of photographers and activists, chronicles campaigns for workers' rights, racial equality, environmental protections, and LGBTQ liberation. The camera served as both silent witness and active catalysts, from individuals documenting their struggles to photojournalists seeking impactful images. Clary says it was important to also trace the evolution of photography as a medium.
We start off with the very kind of static photographs, predominantly by Christina Broom, who was the first woman press photographer of the suffragettes. And she was taking these photographs with plate cameras. And you see how you're starting to get much more kind of dynamic image with the introduction of the 35mm camera. We wanted to then be able to flag how things like the medium format or the shift to kind of single lens reflex, how this again changed the way photographers were able to work. There's a very interesting point in the 1970s where you start to see what's described as embedded photography, which is where with lighter, more flexible cameras, you have this sense of photographers being able to get closer to the action or being able to take possibly more intimate photographs than they have done previously. And also the dissemination of information, this idea about the circulation of images and how that changes is also something we wanted to address.
Descriptions of how these photographs were taken enhances the images. Cameras are hidden in top hats, capturing forbidden pictures of suffragettes in court, or smuggled into Belfast's Maze prison during the Troubles to expose the mistreatment of its prisoners. And as the technologies evolved, so too did the acts of resistance themselves, as generations of dissenters learnt from one another.
There's a sort of ebb and flow throughout all of the show, and you can see this idea of different groups learning from their predecessors. So whether it's, Greenham Common and women at Greenham Common using similar strategies to the suffragettes in terms of going limp at the point where they're being arrested because it makes it harder for them to be removed, things like that. The whole concept of marching and how that's then taken on. So strategies are taken and adapted and evolved and played out. I think you can see alliances in relation to kind of women's lib and gay liberation in the 70s, and a sense that resistance sometimes can be joyful. You see that very much in the 1970s and the kiss-ins, where the act of affection can itself be a political act. And I think that was really what we wanted to show, that there was a kind of real wide range of experience, really. And I think that was also why it was important to end with telling the story of Brian Hall, peace protester. He gave a decade of his life campaigning against foreign policy, which initially was a protest against foreign policy in relation to Afghanistan, but then being this major protest against Britain's position on Iraq. And I think there is a sense of the role of the individual, or the responsibility of the individual within all of this. I think was something that Steve also wanted us to reflect on.
The exhibition is more than a timeline of dissent. It serves as a reflection of social history, preserving memory, providing a documentary perspective, and sharing first-hand accounts in a powerful act of remembrance. For Monocle Radio, I'm Maisie Ringer.
Thank you, Maisie. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Elisabeth, Braw and Ben Kelly. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jukes. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.